When the HOA bulldozed Big Shaq's home, they didn't just cross a line. They triggered a storm buried beneath silence. The quiet man with the leaning porch wasn't just a neighbor. Big Shaq owned every deed they thought they controlled. And Oak Ridge? It was never theirs to govern. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Oak Ridge had a stillness to it, not the kind that came from peace, but the kind that came from everything being in its place. The sidewalks were scrubbed, mailboxes stood identical in height, lawns were so precisely trimmed, it was hard to tell if they grew at all. It was the kind of suburb where nothing happened out of line, and if it did, it was quietly corrected by morning. The sun clung to the rooftops like a golden filter, wrapping the entire neighborhood in a glow that almost made it seem perfect. Almost tucked in the corner of Birch Hollow Lane, shaded by an old oak tree that hadn't quite gotten the memo on uniformity, stood a modest home, with chipped shutters and a front porch that leaned a little to the left. This was where Shaquille O'Neal lived. Not the sports icon, not the television personality, just Big Shaq, the man who waved at every dog walker, fixed old bikes for the neighborhood kids, and shoveled driveways before anyone else was awake. He didn't talk much. When he did, it was usually with his hands, lifting groceries for old folks, patching fences, building garden boxes for young moms who couldn't afford them. The folks around Oak Ridge never asked too many questions. They knew Big Shaq wasn't from around here originally. They whispered that he had money, real money, but he never flashed it. He drove a dusty Chevy, wore hoodies that had seen 100 laundromats, and sat on his porch with a cup of black coffee, like he was just another man trying to mind his peace. And that's exactly how most people liked it. He didn't challenge the neighborhood's rhythm. He didn't ruffle the pattern. He just existed, quietly, respectfully, and without complaint. But there was one man who did not like that. His name was Travis Kinley, president of the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association, a title he wore like a sheriff's badge. Travis was the kind of man who kept his hair parted with mathematical precision and ironed his jeans before mowing the lawn. To him, order wasn't a value. It was a weapon. He ran the HOA like a silent regime, issuing polite threats through newsletter language and burying control in rules that no one could argue with because they were so damn reasonable. Travis had noticed Big Shaq the moment he moved in. Not just his size, which was impossible to miss, but his presence. There was something too grounded about him. Too calm, like he knew something no one else did. Like he didn't need to prove anything. Travis hated that. The HOA president spent years perfecting Oak Ridge, and this one man with his uneven porch and his too loud wind chimes was like a stone in his shoe. On paper, Travis had no real reason to target Shaq. But the truth was, he didn't need one. He just needed time, and time always gave HOA presidents the excuse they were looking for. It started with the mailbox. Shaq's was an inch too short. Then the porch light. It cast a non-standard hue. The letters came in envelopes so thick they required extra postage. Shaq read them, folded them neatly, and placed them in a drawer without ever responding. He didn't change the mailbox. He didn't swap out the bulb. He didn't attend the meetings where Travis displayed pie charts about neighborhood integrity. He simply stayed. Behind closed doors, Travis used coded language when discussing Shaq. Words like unresponsive, non-compliant, and not a good fit for the tone of the neighborhood. No one said race. They didn't have to. In Oak Ridge, racism came dressed in khakis and smiled while delivering consequences. There were others who felt it too, but quietly. Jolene Harper lived 2 houses down. She was a mother of one, worked nights at the hospital and slept through the day when she could. Her son Riley was 15, sharp-minded, and growing into the kind of teenager that made Oak Ridge's elders uncomfortable. He wore hoodies, he skateboarded, he was biracial. At school, teachers watched him like a problem they expected to solve. At home, he kept to himself. He barely spoke to neighbors, except Shaq. Shaq had built him a ramp for his board, taught him how to change a tire, showed him how to hold his anger without letting it rot him from the inside. Riley didn't say much in return, but he sat next to Shaq on the porch more times than his own dining table. Jolene noticed. She didn't ask questions. She just smiled in thanks when Shaq fixed her fence for the 3rd time without being asked. What no one knew, not Jolene, not Riley, not even the curious old women who peeked from their curtains whenever Shaq walked by, was that the quiet man in the hoodie didn't just live on Birch Hollow Lane. He owned it. In fact, he owned all of Oak Ridge piece by piece, house by house, tucked into an intricate web of LLCs and holding companies that made him invisible in paperwork. After the 2008 crash, when banks sold off properties like candy, Shaq had watched families pushed out of communities they helped build, so he started buying. Quietly, anonymously, always under the radar. He didn't raise rents. He didn't push people out. He simply held the land, so no one else could take it from them. Oak Ridge was his garden, and he let it grow without anyone knowing who planted it. But that only made Travis angrier, because control doesn't like to be unseen, and Travis could feel his grip loosening. He started organizing block audits, clipboard in hand, inspecting mulch depth and mailbox paint like he was inspecting a military unit. Every week, another letter, another fine, another public shaming at the HOA meetings, where he casually mentioned unnamed residents who were bringing down property values. Shaq never retaliated, never raised his voice, never once reminded anyone of who he was, or what he owned, or what he was capable of. But in the silence, there was something else. A weight, a waiting. One Thursday afternoon, as the sun settled into its usual warm haze over Oak Ridge, Travis stood outside Shaq's house with a camera, taking pictures of a bird feeder that apparently wasn't architecturally compliant. Shaq stepped onto his porch, just stood there, mug in hand, not a word said. Travis glanced up, met his gaze for the briefest second, and something in that look made him step back. Just a half step, but it was Later that night, Travis filed an emergency complaint about an unsafe structural hazard, the kind of complaint that, if rubber-stamped by the right city office, could lead to citations, demolition, and removal. Paper war was what men like Travis specialized in. And he had no idea that he had started it with the one man who had built an empire out of being underestimated. Meanwhile, Riley was slipping. He came home with a black eye he said was from basketball. Jolene didn't believe him. He stopped going to the community center, where he used to tutor younger kids. His silence grew heavier. Shaq noticed, but he didn't ask. He just left tools out on the porch for Riley to use, books stacked near the steps. An old boxing bag hung discreetly under the carport. Shaq knew about pain, knew that sometimes what young men needed was space and weight, the kind that came from lifting, fixing, building, not lectures, not pity. Travis, however, wasn't giving space. He was tightening his net. He began contacting city inspectors directly, whispering about code violations and community safety. It was becoming clear he wanted Shaq gone. And in neighborhoods like Oak Ridge, they never said it out loud. They just turned the pressure up until you had to leave. But Shaq didn't move. He didn't flinch. He didn't run. He stayed. The wind began to change. And the giant who everyone thought was just part of the background, he was starting to wake up. There was a silence in Oak Ridge that felt manufactured, like it had been ordered, boxed, and delivered. Every hedge clipped to the same angle. Every recycling bin placed at the curb in a precise military line. It was the kind of silence that left no space for individuality, only permission. And for Travis Kinley, that silence was sacred. He protected it like a fragile ecosystem, patrolling with a clipboard, quoting bylaws, the way preachers quoted scripture. But lately, that silence had begun to waver, fractured by one address at the corner of Birch Hollow Lane. Shaq's lawn had grown half an inch too tall. It wasn't wild, just slightly unkempt. Not the kind of thing that would matter in most places. But Oak Ridge wasn't most places. A week after the HOA board meeting, Shaq received a cream-colored envelope with his name typed in sans serif font. Inside was a formal notice, violation of Code Section 3A, lawn height maximum. It wasn't a fine yet, just a friendly reminder. He folded the paper once and slid it into the drawer beneath his keys. He didn't respond. Days later, another letter came. This one pointed out the non-standard porch wind chime, made of driftwood Riley had brought back from a school field trip. Then came the warning about the color of Shaq's mailbox, followed by a complaint about the height of his bird feeder. Each letter sharper, more official. The language softened with phrases like "your cooperation is appreciated," and "we're simply trying to maintain our community standards." But the tone was clear. "You don't belong here, not the way you are." Shaq remained still. No emails, no phone calls. He simply kept living. He watered his plants. He helped Jolene fix the cracked sidewalk in front of her driveway. He stood on his porch during sunset, sipping his coffee, watching the world try to tighten around him. Travis noticed, and it only fueled him. Travis had a way of making cruelty seem civil. He never yelled, never insulted. Instead, he crafted his attacks through policy revisions and mailed memos. He began slipping comments into HOA newsletters. Coded lines like certain residents failing to uphold the values of our community, or non-compliance increases crime risk and property devaluation. No names, just a nudge. Just enough to plant a thought. There was something particularly American about the way Travis wielded power. Not through overt aggression, but through documentation, committee votes, and strategic whispers. He never mentioned race. That was the trick. But everyone understood who the target was. And Shaq understood too. Still, he said nothing. The letters continued. Fines began to stack, first $50 for the lawn, then $75 for excessive porch items, then $100 for non-regulation lighting, even though the bulbs were bought at the same Home Depot as everyone else's. By the end of the month, the fines totaled $425. That's when Travis took it further. He sent an official HOA disciplinary report, labeling Shaq non-compliant resident Tier 2. The language wasn't just bureaucratic, it was dehumanizing. Shaq read the report, folded it in thirds, placed it in the same drawer. Still, he didn't flinch. But something had shifted. Across the street, Jolene started getting letters too. Her trash bins were improperly aligned. Her garden hose was visible from the street. Riley's skateboard ramp was cited as a safety hazard. The message was clear. Anyone too close to Shaq was on the list. Riley had been struggling even before the ramp was removed. His school had become a maze of side eyes and offhand comments. Teachers watched him too closely, accused him of attitude for asking questions, docked him points for tone. Classmates whispered things he pretended not to hear. One day he came home with his hoodie torn and blood-crusted at the corner of his lip. Said he slipped on the sidewalk. Jolene knew better. But what could she do? She was working nights, exhausted, trying to keep it together while the neighborhood seemed to close in around them. Shaq started leaving small things for Riley. A new set of bearings for his board. A dog-eared book about survival tactics. A small wooden box with the initials RH burned into it. Riley said little, but he started sitting back on the porch after school again, just watching the street with Shaq, both of them silent, sharing the kind of stillness that didn't need words. Shaq thought often about what it meant to fight. He'd seen real conflict before, seen it chew up neighborhoods, devour men. He didn't believe in answering hostility with noise. He believed in outlasting it, in using patience like a scalpel. But even patience had a temperature, and Oak Ridge was starting to boil. At night, he walked the streets he once saved. After the recession, Oak Ridge had nearly collapsed. Foreclosures hit every block. Families had been pushed out. The banks wanted to strip the land, build condos. That's when Shaq stepped in, bought house after house through layered shell companies. He didn't flip them, he stabilized them. Let families rent for below market. Gave young Yagups a chance to own. He never announced it. He never asked for recognition. He just knew what it felt like to lose your place, and vowed to never let it happen here. And yet here he was, receiving fines on a house he could bulldoze and rebuild in a day. Being threatened by a man whose power only extended as far as the bylaws allowed. It wasn't about money. It was about presence. Travis couldn't stand that someone like Shaq existed in his kingdom without bending a knee. At the next HOA meeting, Travis stood before the small crowd of residents in the clubhouse, pointing to pie charts showing rising violations. He warned of a trend that threatens our shared values. He never mentioned Shaq, but he didn't need to. On a slideshow, he flashed images of the very violations. Shaq's porch, Jolene's bins, Riley's ramp, blurred just enough to give him deniability. These deviations lower the standard, he declared, and standards are what make Oak Ridge strong. There was polite applause, but some faces were uncertain. There were whispers. Shaq's name began surfacing in private conversations. Has he really been that disruptive? Isn't he the one who fixed the community benches last year? Didn't he donate to the park restoration? Doubt was forming. Travis saw it too. That's when he upped his game. The next morning, Jolene received a notice that her lease would not be renewed at the end of the year. No explanation, just change in ownership direction. She knocked on Shaq's door, panic on her face. Shaq listened, nodded, and quietly handed her a sealed envelope. Inside was a deed transfer. The house was hers, paid in full. Jolene wept. Shaq said nothing, just walked her back to the sidewalk and returned to trimming his overgrown lawn. That week, Riley skipped school. He sat on the porch steps with his board beside him, staring at the street like it had betrayed him. Shaq sat beside him for a long time before finally speaking. Pain teaches, but it doesn't define. Riley didn't reply, but that night, he started sketching again. This time a mural. He didn't say what it was, but Shaq noticed the colors, earth tones, sky tones, a long shadow wrapped in sunlight. The HOA, undeterred, continued its campaign. More notices, more veiled threats. Travis started attending city council meetings, pushing for stricter enforcement of neighborhood codes. He pushed a motion for enhanced compliance inspections, citing vague concerns about safety. Behind the curtain, he was lobbying city inspectors, offering incentives to cite non-conforming homes, most of which belonged to renters, single mothers, or anyone whose skin wasn't pale enough for the cover of a real estate brochure. Still, Shaq did not respond. He fixed his mailbox, painted it regulation gray, removed the wind chime, trimmed the lawn. He did it without rush, without urgency, almost like he was waiting. Travis mistook it for surrender. He smiled as he drafted a final compliance violation, this time citing chronic disregard for community aesthetics. It was the pretext he needed. If the citation held, it would trigger a hearing, one that could legally allow for the demolition of Shaq's home, under nuisance abatement clauses, buried deep in the HOA charter. He mailed it with pride. Certified. Hand-signed. That night, a storm rolled quietly through Oak Ridge, not with thunder but with something colder. And on Birch Hollow Lane, beneath the soft hiss of sprinklers and porch lights, a giant sat in silence, reading the letter not with fear, but with finality. Because sometimes a man stays silent, not because he's defeated, but because he's chosen the exact moment to speak. The morning sun hung over Oak Ridge like a lie. It was too bright, too warm for what was about to unfold. The air smelled of fresh-cut grass and jasmine from neatly trimmed front lawns, but beneath it lingered the scent of machinery, hot oil, steel, and something artificial. Nothing about that morning felt right. Though most residents didn't realize it until it was too late, others did. They looked out their windows, coffee in hand, watching with hesitant eyes as two unmarked white trucks rolled slowly down Birch Hollow Lane. The lead truck carried a demolition claw, its metal fingers resting like a threat. The second was a utility van, its logo hastily covered in gray tape. There were no city vehicles, no marked cars, no flashing lights, just silence, and men in neon vests who moved too quickly to be routine. By the time the trucks parked across from Shaq's home, the HOA-issued emergency demolition notice had already been tacked to his door, dated, unsigned, but laminated for good measure. Across the neighborhood, no alarms rang out, no neighbors intervened. They watched with cautious detachment, unsure of the legality, but certain of one thing: if it was happening in Oak Ridge, it had to be authorized. They had been conditioned to believe the HOA operated with divine authority, as if the bylaws had the weight of law itself. The crew didn't wait for confirmation. A man with a hard hat lifted his arm, signaled forward, and the claw came to life. At the same moment, just a few miles away, Shaq stood inside a school gymnasium, watching Riley sprint the length of a basketball court. It was a community clinic day. No uniforms, no refs, just local kids moving, sweating, laughing. Shaq had brought water jugs and folded towels. He ran drills with Riley's team, taught pivot stances, and reminded them that strength wasn't just in shoulders, but in discipline. Parents sat in the bleachers, grateful for a Saturday morning of peace. There was no phone in his hand, no alert, nothing to warn him that while he was giving, someone else was taking everything he had built. Back on Birch Hollow, the first strike came fast. The claw punched through the roof, snapping support beams like twigs. Wood splintered. Glass exploded. With each pass, Shaq's home folded into itself, not with fury, but with precision. The porch caved, the front door snapped, and the kitchen wall collapsed outward, revealing framed photos that scattered into the dirt. A ceramic teapot rolled down the driveway, unbroken. No one picked it up. Jolene watched from her window, one hand pressed to her mouth, the other clutching her son's shoulder. Riley stood beside her, unmoving. His jaw tightened, fists curled, eyes wide with something between disbelief and grief. He had sat on that porch for years, had drawn pictures at that kitchen table, had seen Shaq rebuild that house piece by piece after storms, after time, and now it was gone. In minutes. No one from the city was present. No legal representative. No warrant taped to a clipboard. Just the hollow echo of an engine grinding its way through a man's history. By noon, it was done. Where there was once a home, there was now a crater of debris, crushed wood, insulation, shrapnel of everyday life. The workers packed up without ceremony, barely speaking to one another. They left behind a single sign, property condemned, under review. It flapped in the breeze like a dirty flag. Shaq returned 2 hours later. The gym had emptied. He had stayed behind to sweep the court. It was habit, the way he did everything. Quietly, without announcement. When he pulled onto Birch Hollow Lane, the trucks were gone. But the space, that gaping space, was impossible to miss. He parked the Chevy at the curb and stepped out. The sound of gravel under his shoes was the only noise on the street. He walked to the edge of the lot, hands in his hoodie pockets, and stared. He didn't ask questions, didn't shout. He simply stood still. The house was unrecognizable, just chunks of what once was, sunken into the dirt like bones after fire. The wind lifted a torn curtain from the wreckage and let it fall again. Shaq exhaled, slow and long. His eyes didn't tear, his face didn't twist, but something in his posture shifted, something subtle, like an old gate locking into place. His head turned slightly, scanning the row of homes around him. He saw the curtains move, saw neighbors who didn't wave, saw the absence of solidarity in the stillness. Then he turned around. Not fast, not slow, just deliberate. He walked back to his truck, climbed in and drove off without a sound. No skid of tires, no slammed door, just departure. That night, Oak Ridge didn't sleep. It wasn't fear exactly. It was something deeper. A vibration in the chest. The kind of discomfort that comes when you've witnessed something unjust and didn't stop it. People avoided the wreckage, crossing the street to walk their dogs. Kids asked questions their parents couldn't answer. Why did they do that to Mr. Shaq's house? Did he do something wrong? Where did he go? No one knew, and that was the problem. Inside Jolene's house, Riley didn't speak. He opened his sketchbook and tore out every drawing he'd made of the porch. Then he started a new page. One image. A silhouette. Wide shoulders. Head down. Back turned to a burning structure. Smoke curling into the shape of a crown. Travis Kinley, meanwhile, poured himself a glass of bourbon in his study, the HOA charter open on his desk. He clicked his pen, tapped it against a printout of the demolition notice, and smiled. It hadn't required a court order, just a loophole, a clause about community safety hazards and emergency compliance actions. The board hadn't questioned it, the city hadn't been informed, and no one had stopped it. To him that meant it worked. But even Travis felt something strange that night. The bourbon didn't settle like it usually did. The silence outside didn't feel triumphant. It felt thin, like it might snap under the weight of something invisible. Across the street, Jolene stood at her window well past midnight. The rubble was lit by a single street lamp. In its center, a cracked piece of foundation had Shaq's name scratched into it, faded but legible. She thought of knocking on doors, asking questions. But what would she say? What could undo what had been done? In a neighborhood so obsessed with appearances, the image of destruction lingered louder than any conversation. People who once nodded at Shaq in passing now avoided eye contact, unsure of what role they'd played in the silence that enabled it. Some felt shame, others felt relief, but all of them felt something, and Oak Ridge didn't like to feel. The next morning came like it always did. Sprinklers turned on at 6 a.m. Joggers followed the same sidewalk loops, and HOA reminders went out via email. But something was broken. Not just the house, the illusion. Because no one could quite forget the way Shaq had stood there alone, towering over rubble, refusing to react. Not with rage, not with grief, just with presence. And that kind of presence stays. The Monday after the demolition, the Oak Ridge Community Center buzzed with a strange electricity. Inside the cool beige-toned hall lined with flags and framed awards for excellence in neighborhood governance, Travis Kinley stood before the HOA board in a crisp navy blazer. His usual smugness replaced with something closer to smug triumph. He tapped the podium twice with a metal pointer, waking the sleepy eyes in the room. The overhead projector flicked on with a loud hum, displaying a slide titled "Restoring Order Phase 1 Complete." He cleared his throat and leaned in. "Ladies and gentlemen," Travis began, eyes sweeping the room like a stage actor soaking in applause. We've made a bold move, and bold moves are what preserve value, structure, and let's be honest, civilization in communities like ours. A few board members exchanged glances. One coughed awkwardly, but no one challenged him. They rarely did. Travis continued. Last week's emergency intervention was not only legal, it was necessary. Eyesores have no place in Oak Ridge. Not when we've worked so hard to make this the safest, cleanest, most desirable zip code in the county. He clicked to the next slide, a time-lapse of Shaq's house being bulldozed. A literal before and after reel. Travis smirked. This is progress. That word echoed louder than intended. Progress. A word that had meant something different once. A word that, in this moment, felt more like a verdict. No one applauded. But no one objected either. The meeting ended 15 minutes early. The next morning, every resident on Birch Hollow Lane, and every street beyond it in Oak Ridge, received a knock on their door. Delivery men in collared shirts and blue baseball caps handed out thick certified envelopes. Inside each was a letter printed on textured paper with an embossed letterhead. O'Neill Properties Group LLC. The message was brief and cold. This letter serves as formal notice that your current lease agreement will not be renewed. Please vacate the premises within 90 days from receipt. A new ownership strategy is in effect. Some received second pages. Those who owned their homes outright got notices of purchase offers, well above market value, but marked non-negotiable. Others, particularly long-time tenants, got stricter deadlines, 60 days, even 45. There was no contact number list, just an email, admin@1elpropgroup. Within hours, group chats lit up. The Oak Ridge Facebook page turned into a digital bonfire. Panic spread like spilled gasoline. Was this a mistake? Was someone buying out the whole neighborhood? Were they being sold off to developers? Where would they go? Was this connected to Shaq? The biggest question of all, though, went unanswered the longest. Who was O'Neill Properties Group? That answer came slower, and with it an uncomfortable truth. By noon, someone had connected the dots. Public real estate records showed a pattern. Houses across Oak Ridge, owned by different shell companies, all linked to one private holding group, O'Neill Properties. A few legal blogs and data nerds dug deeper. The group had been buying homes quietly for over a decade, not flipping them, not selling them, just holding them, preserving them, protecting them. And at the center of it all, though not publicly listed, was the name that made the air go still. Shaquille R. O'Neal, the same man whose house had just been reduced to dust. People didn't know whether to feel guilty, relieved, or betrayed. The man they'd watched walk his dog, trim his bushes, coach their kids, mow other people's lawns, had owned their roofs the whole time. The HOA board met in emergency session. The word retaliation was floated, but no legal action could be taken. Every property acquisition was clean, every lease contract airtight. The letters were real. The clock had started ticking. At a small house just outside the Oak Ridge boundary, Shaq sat on a back porch, sipping his coffee as if the world weren't unraveling around his quiet choices. The sky was pale, washed in early light. In the distance, birdsong mixed with the hum of morning traffic. He didn't seem angry. He didn't seem triumphant. He seemed exact. Behind him, the screen door creaked open. Lucille O'Neill, elegant in a dark olive coat and Sunday shoes, stepped out and sat beside her son without a word. She didn't look at him right away, just stared into the horizon, her hands folded in her lap like a woman raised on manners and sermons. You know what your daddy used to say, she murmured finally. Grace comes first. Justice comes second. Shaq nodded once, eyes still fixed on the distance. I gave him grace. Lucille's voice softened but didn't shake. You sure you're ready to give him justice? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Meanwhile, Riley had found him. Word had spread fast. Jolene had cried when the eviction notice came. Though she didn't blame him. She knew it wasn't about her. It was about something deeper. But Riley didn't understand. Not yet. He showed up alone, sweat on his neck, sketchbook under his arm. He stood by the porch like he was bracing for a gust of wind. You're letting them win, he said. No hello, no warm-up. You let them take your house. Now you're scaring people. What's this gonna fix? Shaq looked at him, really looked at him, and something passed between them that was older than words. They haven't seen the scoreboard yet. Riley didn't know what that meant. Not then, but it lodged in him like a seed. Later that day, the street outside the rubble of Shaq's former home was filled with whispers. Neighbors gathered near the edge of the lot, uncertain whether to cross the caution tape. The demolition had left behind not just a pile of ruins, but a question no one wanted to answer. Was this place ever really theirs? In truth, Oak Ridge had never belonged to its residents, not since the crash of 2008, when families were pushed out and developers circled like buzzards. That was when Shaq made his move, not out of greed, but preservation. He bought quiet. He bought space. He bought time. At first it was one house, a foreclosure 2 blocks from his own, then 5 more, then 20, each deed signed by a different company, each title nested within another. He hired lawyers who understood discretion, and contractors who didn't ask questions. When rent came due, he kept it below market. When a family needed help, a check arrived with no sender. He wasn't saving them. He was shielding them. All this time, Travis had thought he was controlling the game, writing the rules, making the calls, but he'd been standing on a chessboard built by the man he tried to erase. Now the pawns were waking up. And the king? He wasn't just watching anymore. The silence in Oak Ridge no longer felt clean. It felt cluttered with unspoken questions, unsent apologies, and the invisible dust of old assumptions breaking apart. Mornings used to sound like sprinklers, leaf blowers, and casual greetings across white picket fences. Now it was whispers, glances, unfinished sentences. At bus stops and mailbox, in driveways and online threads, one question burned quietly through the neatly organized streets. Did Big Shaq own my house? No one wanted to ask it directly, but everyone wanted the answer. By midweek, the rumor had become a reckoning. Tenants compared lease documents and found commonalities, identical formatting, the same anonymous Dropbox addresses, identical renewal clauses. Homeowners cross-checked property histories, only to find that title transfers led to the same maze of holding companies. It was undeniable Shaquille O'Neal, the man they'd seen power washing sidewalks and handing out school supplies, had owned more than anyone had realized. Possibly everything. The realization hit people in waves. First shock, then guilt. He'd been right in front of them, helping, giving, protecting, and they'd let him be humiliated. Worse, they'd watched it happen and said nothing. For some, the guilt morphed into admiration. For others, it became fear. But what unified everyone was a single paralyzing awareness. Shaq had never needed their permission. At Jolene Harper's kitchen table, eviction notice still pinned to the fridge with a cracked magnet, she stared across at the man who had signed it. She hadn't cried this time. She'd done that already. She sat with her hands clasped in front of her like she was back in church, searching for mercy in a moment that felt unfair and unrecognizable. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. "You've already made your point." Shaq didn't answer right away. He stirred his tea with the patience of a man who never rushed anything. Outside, Riley's sketchbook sat closed on the porch bench, its corners worn, edges charred from too much thought. "I didn't make the rules," Shaq said finally, his voice like gravel warmed by sunlight. "I just stopped pretending they weren't rigged." Jolene leaned forward. "But these people, not all of them knew. Not all of them were part of it." Shaq's gaze lifted to hers, steady and unblinking. "And yet not one of them stopped it. Not one stood on my lawn when they razed my home." Her voice cracked, just slightly. "But you're not like them. You're better." Shaq looked toward the window, where a father across the street was loading soccer balls into the back of a minivan. "Sometimes," he said, "to rebuild peace, you've got to show them the war." The words lingered in the air, not as a threat, but as truth. Meanwhile, Travis Kinley was unraveling. The control he'd clung to so tightly, so smugly, had begun slipping through his fingers like sand. He showed up to the next HOA board meeting, with a new haircut, and a thicker binder, as if paperwork could save him, but the board members had changed. Their eyes weren't just tired, they were watchful now, uncertain. They asked questions they hadn't before. "Did you authorize the demolition without legal clearance? Did you know about the ownership structure? Why weren't we informed of the full implications?" Travis deflected with the same practiced charm he'd always relied on. "Let's focus on the positive outcomes. We've removed a destabilizing element. The neighborhood can heal." But the room didn't nod in unison this time. Outside, someone had spray-painted the sidewalk in front of the HOA office. "WHO owns your house." Travis called the city to remove it by morning, but by then, someone had repainted it. This time in brighter color, bolder lines. The shift wasn't just political, it was personal. Residents started remembering things. How Shaq paid for the replacement swing set at Hollow Park when the HOA claimed there were no funds. How he stayed behind after community cleanups, raking leaves long after others left. How he repaired gutters for elderly neighbors without accepting payment. How he bought 20 Thanksgiving turkeys in a single year and dropped them off anonymously. It hadn't registered then. Not really. They thought it was charity. Now they saw it for what it was. Ownership without ego. Leadership without a throne. The growing awareness sparked something in Riley. He spent 2 nights sitting on the curb near the rubble of Shaq's old home. Sketchbook open. Spray cans beside him. Headphones in. He worked slowly, meticulously, waiting for the streetlights to change the texture of the wall. When he was done, the mural stretched across the concrete like a wound turned into artwork. A towering silhouette rose from painted earth, broad-shouldered and bowed at the head, rooted in soil that bloomed into homes, gardens, and people. Across the top in looping graffiti text, he wrote, "They tried to bury him. They didn't know he was the soil." It was more than art. It was declaration. Within hours, someone took a photo and posted it online. The mural went viral before noon. Local news picked it up. The caption sparked debate. Pride, anger, confusion. Travis called it graffiti in an official statement. But no one came to paint over it. Not this time. The mural became a gathering point. People left candles, notes, apologies. There were vigils at night. Quiet, cautious at first, then bolder. Families brought lawn chairs. Teens lit incense. Riley stood at the edge each night, watching strangers sit beside something he had made, something Shaq had inspired. But even as solidarity grew, so did tension. Not everyone appreciated the shift. A few residents, those who had always admired Travis's strict order, felt betrayed by the uncertainty. If he owned everything, why didn't he tell us? One woman asked. At the bakery counter. Feels manipulative. Others worried about what came next. Would rents go up? Would the whole place be sold? Was this the start of a bigger change? That fear fermented into friction. One afternoon, 2 longtime residents got into a shouting match outside the post office, one defending Shaq, the other blaming him for destabilizing the community. The argument didn't escalate beyond words, but it drew a crowd, and the HOA issued a new bulletin calling for civility during times of transition. But the time for quiet was over. This wasn't just about houses anymore. It was about who had been watching when the house fell, and who had looked away. Shaq, for his part, remained invisible. He made no public statements, no interviews. He answered no emails, but his silence wasn't absence. It was atmosphere. His presence now filled every space he had once walked. In barbershops, in schoolyards, in grocery aisles, people spoke about him like myth. Except the stories were real, and the consequences lived in their mailboxes. Even the city took notice. Council members scheduled a private inquiry into the HOA's structure and its recent unauthorized demolition. The city attorney's office opened a quiet probe. Travis, once invited to ribbon cuttings and fundraisers, now received polite cancellations. The walls were closing in, and he felt it. In a moment of desperation, he sent a formal letter to Shaq. It arrived typed, folded neatly, marked personal and confidential. Inside, Travis extended an offer to mediate this situation in the spirit of mutual interest. It ended with a plea: let us move forward. Let Oak Ridge recover. Shaq never opened it. He didn't have to. He already knew how it would end. It began with a folder. Slim, sharp, and delivered by hand to the Oak Ridge HOA, legal representative's office at precisely 9 a.m. on a Wednesday. Inside, a lawsuit. The HOA was suing Shaquille R. O'Neal. The charge: malicious property interference, community destabilization, and ironically, unauthorized property ownership. Travis Kinley had drafted the claim himself, with the help of a firm notorious for aggressive civil litigation. He believed the legal system would bend to precedent, procedure, and polished language. But it didn't take long for the first cracks to show. Within 48 hours, the city clerk's office returned the filing. The lawsuit had been rejected. Not for lack of paperwork, but because of one simple fatal flaw. The HOA had no standing. Shaq's ownership structure, layered across 6 different LLCs, 3 trusts, and a multi-state holding partnership, was airtight. Not only did he have full legal title to the majority of Oak Ridge's properties, but every lease and property contract had been crafted under corporate protection, governed by out-of-county jurisdiction, and immune to local HOA enforcement. Legally, the HOA had no authority over any of the homes in question. Travis stared at the rejection notice. The bolded phrase, "lacks standing to file," mocking him from the page like a slap. He paced his office, loosening his tie, trying to imagine a next move. But there wasn't one. Not one that wouldn't blow back harder. What he didn't know was that the real blow had already been set in motion from within his own board. Her name was Lorraine Banner. She'd served on the HOA board for 11 years. The kind of woman who wore floral scarves in the summer and brought lemon bars to every meeting. People thought of her as harmless, forgettable, which is exactly how she'd managed to go unnoticed, as she quietly collected documents, emails, bank transfers, private memos. She had grown tired of the bullying, the coded language, the way Travis used order as a mask for prejudice. So she blew the whistle. Lorraine sent a digital folder to the city council, the media, and to Shaq's own legal counsel. Inside were detailed accounts of fund misuse, unauthorized compliance fines disproportionately levied on minority residents, internal notes singling out problematic tenants, and payment requests for private investigators used to surveil residents, including Jolene and Riley. The documents leaked within hours. A local journalist picked up the story, then a regional news station, then national outlets. It was irresistible. A wealthy former NBA player secretly owning a neighborhood, an HOA caught targeting families. A mural turned into a movement. The headlines wrote themselves. The HOA who tried to evict the landlord. Big Shaq, bigger silence, biggest checkmate. How a neighborhood lost its power overnight. Camera crews lined the outer streets of Oak Ridge. Reporters knocked on doors. Some residents refused to speak. Others aired years of resentment. Jolene's statement aired on the evening news. He protected us when no one else would, and we failed him when it counted. Meanwhile, Travis unraveled in real time. He started receiving anonymous letters, some threatening, others mocking. Someone spray-painted paper sheriff across his garage door. At a local coffee shop, he was refused service. His LinkedIn page was flooded with comments. Former colleagues distanced themselves publicly. His reputation as a community builder evaporated like mist in heat. He issued a press release, then a second one, then a shaky on-camera apology, standing in front of the very clubhouse where he once boasted of progress. But it was too late. The illusion had shattered. No one believed him anymore. Even the HOA board was turning. Lorraine stepped down, and in her resignation, publicly endorsed Shaq's character and transparency. Through it all, Shaq remained out of the spotlight. No press conferences, no rebuttals. Instead, he found his stillness in an old cedar box tucked away in his closet. Inside were letters handwritten and yellowed from age. His father had written them during his army years, sent from foreign bases, deserts, and makeshift barracks. Shaq unfolded one slowly, the edges soft from time. Legacy is not what they write about you when you die. It's what they live with when you're gone. Don't chase the noise, son. Build something that don't need volume to echo. Shaq read those lines over and over, the script etched into his mind like a blueprint. It wasn't about revenge. It never had been. It was about stewardship, about correcting a system that had grown so used to its own cruelty. It had forgotten what fairness even looked like. With the lawsuit dead and the HOA fractured, Shaq made his next move quiet as ever, but seismic in effect. He began repurchasing select properties, not for development or resale, but for gifting. Longtime renters who had always paid on time, who had built lives and gardens and traditions within Oak Ridge, received surprise visits from Shaq's legal team. Deeds were transferred, mortgages erased, ownership handed over, free and clear. The first was a retired couple who had lived at the end of Pine Bark Lane since 1993. The second, a school teacher and her 2 daughters. Then came a widower with a disability. Then a war veteran. Then Jolene. When Shaq arrived at Jolene's door, she opened it without a word. He handed her a folder. Inside, her name sat alone on a title page, stamped and certified. Her fingers trembled as she looked up at him. "You don't owe me this," she whispered. "I don't owe it," Shaq replied. "I chose it." Riley watched from the hallway, sketchbook in hand, the mural now framed in digital prints sold for charity. He didn't say anything, but his eyes met Shaq's, and in that glance was the unspoken passing of a torch. Back on Birch Hollow Lane, the lot where Shaq's house once stood remained untouched. The debris had been cleared, but no construction began. Just flat earth and a single tree. Some thought he would build a mansion, others expected a museum, or a monument. But nothing came, and that absence became its own kind of power. Because sometimes, emptiness says more than a tower. The city council convened in a special hearing. HOA reform was introduced. New leadership was elected. Travis resigned quietly, his final act being the sale of his own home. Purchased at an inflated price by a company he couldn't trace, he left town without fanfare, escorted by the same silence he once imposed on others. In the distance, clouds gathered over Oak Ridge. Not rain, just pressure. The air thick with reflection, regret, hope. A storm was coming, but this one didn't bring wind. It brought the truth. Each morning began the same. Just after sunrise, when the light was soft enough to forgive what had happened, but strong enough to show what remained, Shaq stepped out onto the field where his house used to be. The lot, once littered with broken beams and shattered glass, had been cleared, but not paved. No flags, no fences, just packed dirt, wild grass, and a single tree standing crooked at the edge of the space, like it had survived the storm on purpose. Shaq walked it slowly, not to measure, not to plan, but to remember. He moved with the rhythm of a man, not haunted, but humbled, pausing at invisible thresholds, glancing toward where a window once caught the morning sun, or where the back porch sagged under the weight of too many quiet evenings. He didn't bring tools, he didn't take notes, he just walked, and every day he was never truly alone. It started with one. A boy on a bike, no more than 10, watched him from the sidewalk for 3 mornings, before finally pedaling across the grass and falling into step behind him. The boy didn't ask questions, just walked. Then came 2 more, sisters who lived down the lane, holding juice boxes and curiosity. Then came others, children of every color and background, faces familiar and new, sneakers kicking up dust as they followed the silent giant through what used to be a home, and was now something more complicated. Memory turned into ritual. Shaq never told them why he walked. But when they came, he gave them lessons disguised as conversation. He pointed to the lot and spoke about things they didn't yet understand. Foundations that hold even when walls fall, how to stand still in chaos, why silence is sometimes louder than shouting. He brought chalk one day, drew lines in the dirt, blueprints of what once was. Bedrooms, kitchen, front stoop. He asked them, "What's missing?" One said a pool, another said, "A treehouse." One girl said, "Nothing really. It's still yours." He didn't correct her. By the second week, the lot became a kind of open-air classroom. No desks, just stories. Lessons about legacy, not loss. Some kids came just to watch. Others stayed behind to clean up candy wrappers or rake leaves around the tree. They didn't know the history of the land. Not all of it, but they knew something powerful had happened here, and that somehow they were part of what came next. Meanwhile, far from Birch Hollow Lane, Travis Kinley was running. Not literally, not yet, but in every way that mattered. After his resignation from the HOA board and the unraveling of his public image, he tried to disappear into the safety of bureaucracy, applied for a new job in a neighboring district, tried to refinance his house under a different trust, even listed his SUV for sale under an alias. But he didn't get far. The subpoena came mid-morning, delivered by 2 city clerks in suits with clipped tones. Travis stood in the doorway in sweatpants, pretending not to be surprised. He didn't argue. He signed, and then he shut the door and sat at his kitchen counter, staring at a pot of cold coffee that hadn't been poured. The court hearing wasn't flashy. No cameras inside, no loud protests, just rows of seats, the steady clack of legal shoes on tile, and a judge with tired eyes. But what emerged inside that courtroom would echo far beyond the walls. The case wasn't against Shaq. It was against the HOA itself, and Travis as its orchestrator. Over 3 days, a mountain of evidence surfaced. Misused funds, forged citations, internal emails that labeled families as undesirable tenants and tracked their activity like criminal surveillance. Surveillance logs, anonymous complaints traced back to Travis's own IP address, HOA board meetings where votes were rigged, decisions predetermined, testimonies from former residents who had been fined out of their homes. One man, a war vet, broke down as he recalled losing the house his wife died in over a lawn furniture dispute. In the middle of it all sat Shaq, not at the front, not as a witness, but in the back row, silent, arms folded, watching as the truth clawed its way to the surface. When it came time for closing statements, the city attorney pulled no punches. "This was not governance," she said, her voice low and deliberate. "This was targeted erasure, wrapped in bylaws, hidden in paperwork, and executed with silence, so complete, it almost worked." Outside, the media had already caught wind. The story exploded across screens. HOA bulldozed black millionaire's home. He owned the block. Pundits debated. Lawyers weighed in. Think pieces flooded the internet. But what moved people most wasn't the scale. It was the restraint. The man who could have broken everything with a phone call, who could have sued, shamed, shouted, had stayed silent. Until now. The town hall meeting was packed beyond capacity. Folding chairs filled the aisles. Elderly residents who never attended anything showed up early. Dressed like it was Sunday, teens stood along the walls, some still in school jerseys. Reporters lined the back, pens hovering, ready for the moment. But it wasn't Shaq who took the mic. It was Riley. He stood awkward at first, gripping the edge of the podium like it might run from him. He looked older than he had a month ago, or maybe just clearer. His sketchbook was tucked under one arm. He opened it to the page with the mural, the silhouette, the blooming soil. He didn't speak with rehearsed polish. His voice cracked. He stumbled on a word. But when he said it, the room held its breath. He didn't need a mansion to be royalty. A pause. Y'all treated him like he was lucky to be here. But he was the reason we were safe. And when you took his house, you didn't break him. You proved why we needed him. There were tears. Not all visible. Some swallowed. Some blinked back behind glasses. And pride. A woman from the back stood up and said softly, "I'm sorry." Then another. "We didn't know." Then one more, older voice shaking. "We knew. We just didn't help." Shaq remained seated. He didn't cry. Didn't nod. Didn't move. Just watched. After the meeting, a few approached him. Some hugged him. Others tried. A few simply stood nearby, unsure of what to say. He accepted their presence, not their absolution. That night, Shaq returned to the field. The children were gone. It was too late. The stars were just beginning to pierce the sky, and the tree stood silhouetted in moonlight. He walked the path again, bedroom, kitchen, porch, but this time when he stopped, he looked up. The mural was still there. Faded slightly, weathered by sun, but intact. He placed his hand on the chalk line where the door once stood. And then he closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to mark an ending, and prepare for whatever came next. In the weeks after the courtroom silence and the town hall echoes, Oak Ridge woke up differently. It wasn't dramatic. No one ran into the street shouting. There were no banners, no speeches. But it was in the way morning felt, lighter, maybe, as if the air itself had been scrubbed of tension. It was in how people walked, slower, less guarded. It was in the new voices, especially the young ones that began to fill the spaces where silence used to sit. Where Shaq's home once stood, nothing grand had risen. No monument, no marble, no reconstruction of what had been. In its place sat a trailer, unassuming, olive green, grounded on sturdy cinder blocks, with a modest awning made from recycled wood. It had no satellite dish, no sign, and no gate, just a single porch light, and a front step that creaked under the weight of memory. Shaq had been offered dozens of options. Architects, developers, even city officials offered to fund a rebuild. They suggested blueprints that included a 3-car garage, a rooftop garden, a guest house. He declined them all, politely, firmly, because the point wasn't to rise higher than before, it was to root deeper. From that trailer he oversaw something bigger than blueprints. He brought the community together, not with commands, but with questions. In a gathering held under the old oak tree beside the lot, Shaq asked a single question that shifted everything. What do y'all want this place to feel like? Not look like, not cost like, but feel like. The answers poured out, hesitant at first, then unfiltered. A mural wall for kids, a produce garden for elders, homes with porches close enough to hear your neighbor laugh, sidewalks wide enough for wheelchairs, and kids on scooters, a community board that listened, a library box on every block. Shaq wrote each idea down. Construction began, not long after, but this time, it didn't sound like destruction. It sounded like hammers tapping purpose into wood, like laughter between volunteers, like playlists shared between teens and uncles who didn't know they liked the same music. The builders weren't all professionals. Some were high schoolers, teachers, retired handymen, local artists. It wasn't fast. It wasn't perfect. But it was right. One morning, as framing went up on the Harper home, a cozy single story with light blue siding and a wraparound porch, Shaq called Jolene and Riley over. He handed them a folder. Inside was a deed, their names printed in black ink, notarized and fine. No payments? Jolene asked, holding the paper like it might vanish. Shaq shook his head once. Already paid. Riley, now taller, stood beside his mother. He didn't say much, just opened his sketchbook and handed Shaq a new drawing, this one of the neighborhood, redrawn with gardens, porches, and a single figure standing in the middle, holding a shovel instead of a crown. Thank you, Riley said, and this time it wasn't whispered. As homes rose and stories resurfaced, not everyone stayed the same. Some residents moved. Those who had clung too tightly to the old power structures found themselves uncomfortable in the warmth of the new one. Others returned. Former neighbors who had once been forced out quietly reached out. Shaq found ways to bring them back. He wasn't just restoring houses, he was restoring belonging. As for Travis, his fall was as quiet as his rise had been smug. The court sentenced him to 12 months of house arrest, citing community fraud, civil harassment, and misappropriation of public HOA funds. His home, ironically, sat on a street now lined with families he once tried to evict. An ankle monitor wrapped around the same leg he once used to kick down opportunity. He was banned for life from serving on any HOA board in the state. His face, once featured in real estate ads, now disappeared from public life altogether. No one threw stones. No one egged his house. They simply stopped looking in his direction. It was a heavier sentence than any jail time could have offered. Back in the center of Oak Ridge, kids had taken to calling Shaq something new. Coach. They said it with ease, affection, and unspoken reverence. It started during weekend cleanups, when he'd show them how to fix a broken gate or reroute a sprinkler. Then he started holding Saturday skills sessions in the empty lot beside the trailer. Some basketball drills, sure, but also conflict resolution, resume writing, even garden planning. Coach Shaq, one girl shouted during a community picnic. What's more important, winning or finishing? Shaq smiled. Finishing with someone else still standing beside you. He never wore a whistle, never made a roster, but everyone knew who was leading. One bright afternoon, as autumn began to breathe color into the trees, Lucille O'Neill arrived unannounced. She didn't need to knock. She stood on the front step of the trailer, hands folded, wearing a soft blue blouse and pearl earrings that had seen decades. Shaq opened the door, surprised but not startled. She handed him a photo frame wrapped in a cloth. He peeled it back slowly. Inside was a photo of his father, taken long before Shaq had become a name known in stadium. In it, the man stood with a tool belt around his waist, a hand resting on a beam of a house he helped build, sweat on his brow, and a calm in his eyes. Lucille nodded toward the photo. He used to say, "Make your hands louder than your voice. You done that, son." Over and over. Shaq stared at the photo for a long time. Then, for the first time in what felt like years, he smiled. It wasn't wide, it wasn't loud, but it was real, deep. Lucille didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. The days rolled on, not with headlines, but with healing. Shaq declined every major interview, turned down documentary deals. A production company offered a six-figure check for the rights to dramatize the HOA showdown. He returned it with a note, let them write their own ending. Instead, he spent his mornings with the kids, afternoons in planning meetings, evenings walking the neighborhood just as he had before. But now, doors opened. Now windows waved. Now people looked him in the eye, not out of awe, but out of shared gratitude. There was no victory parade, no banners strung across the clubhouse, just small things, a mother planting flowers beside a new porch, a teenager painting benches at the park, a father teaching his son how to grill, acts that meant more than applause. At the edge of Birch Hollow Lane, where the mural still stood, refreshed by Riley and a team of young volunteers, someone had added a new line beneath the original quote. In small letters, painted in gold, it read, "He didn't raise a roof, he raised a standard." And perhaps that was the legacy that mattered most. Because Oak Ridge wasn't rebuilt by lawsuits or vengeance. It wasn't rebuilt by title deeds or fines. It was rebuilt the way it should have been built in the first place. By hands, by hearts, by the choice to stand beside each other, when it would have been easier to walk away. The smoke from the grill curled slowly into the afternoon sky, soft as ribbon and laced with the scent of charred corn, mesquite chicken, and tangy barbecue sauce. Oak Ridge hadn't seen a community gathering like this in years, maybe ever. Folding tables lined the field, the very one where Shaq's house once stood. There were no signs of rubble now, no echoes of destruction, just laughter, conversation, and the hum of music floating from a wireless speaker, balanced on a stack of milk crates. This wasn't a block party thrown by a board. There were no corporate banners, no sponsored tents. It was paper plates, lemonade pitchers, and grill smoke thick enough to carry memories. The only thing organized was the joy. Children darted between coolers and cornhole boards. Teens hovered near the DJ, pretending not to smile. Neighbors who once passed each other without more than a glance now shared stories like old friends. And in the middle of it all, beneath a hand-built canopy of reclaimed wood, stood Shaq. He wasn't at the center. That wasn't his way. He stood slightly off to the side, near the cooler he'd filled with ice and sodas himself, wearing a loose gray hoodie and sneakers that had seen better days. But people found him anyway. They drifted toward him like planets to gravity, not to worship, but to share. A handshake, a thank you, a photo, a quiet nod. The mural unveiling was scheduled just after sunset, but Riley had already arrived. He sat on the back of his mom's truck bed, legs swinging, paint still under his nails. The new mural had been kept covered for weeks, fabric stretched across the wall, paint drying in silence, anticipation building beneath every brushstroke. No one had seen it but him, and he waited until the light dimmed into gold, and the street lamps blinked alive. Then he stood. People quieted, not because they were told to, but because something in the way he moved told them it was time. Riley stepped forward, grabbed the edge of the fabric, and pulled it down in one smooth motion. The gasps weren't loud, just full. The mural spanned the entire back wall of the rebuilt community garden, painted on reclaimed wood panels from homes that had once been condemned. In it, Shaq sat not on a throne of jewels or gold, but one made of red bricks and wood beams. His posture was steady, eyes calm. Around him, children sat at his feet, listening. Not worshipping, listening. In the background, trees grew, homes bloomed like flowers, and in the corner, painted with the finest detail Riley had ever mustered, was a small plaque. The real version sat beneath the mural, carved in bronze and mounted into a stone base. It read, "He planted peace where they tried to sow control." For a long moment, no one spoke. The music had paused. The grill sizzled in the distance, and the sky, now fully cloaked in dusk, cast a soft light that made the mural glow like something alive. Jolene wiped her eyes with the corner of a napkin. An older man placed his hand on his chest. One of the kids whispered to another, "That's really him." Riley stepped back, letting the mural speak for itself. Shaq didn't approach the front. He didn't need to. He watched from his place near the cooler, arms folded, a rare warmth in his expression. Not pride, not triumph, something simpler, something like peace. Later that night, as the BBQ plates turned to crumbs, and the music faded to low background hums, a few residents gathered near the old oak tree. Someone passed around iced tea, someone else lit citronella candles, and someone, it's not clear who, asked if there was going to be a speech. Shaq shook his head slowly. "I think everything's been said," he answered. Still, they waited, and so in that patient silence, Shaq finally spoke, not to boast, not to recount, but to leave something behind. "They tried to measure me by my lawn," he said. "By my porch, by my skin." A hush swept over the group. "But giants don't fit in fences." He said nothing more. That was the thing about him. He never needed many words, just the right ones. When the crowd thinned and only stars remained overhead, Riley returned to the mural and sat beneath it with his sketchbook. He didn't draw. He just leaned back, hands behind his head, watching the sky. Shaq sat beside him, both staring up like they were waiting for something they already knew had happened. "Think they'll keep it?" Riley asked. Shaq nodded. "They will." Riley kicked at a tuft of grass. "You could have done more. Could have built something huge. A center, a museum, a school." Shaq looked toward the field, toward the porch lights flickering on, one by one. "This is more." Riley didn't respond right away. Then, "I think you were always building something, just took a while to see it." Shaq smiled again. "Rare, but twice in 1 month now. That's the best kind." Eventually, Riley fell asleep there, sketchbook across his chest. Shaq didn't wake him. He draped his hoodie over the boy's shoulders and walked back toward the trailer. Lucille's photo of his father sat on the shelf, angled just so it caught the porch light through the window. Shaq looked at it as he passed, nodding once, quietly. Outside, the night deepened. Crickets sang their rhythm. A breeze moved through the trees, and the mural watched over it all, like a memory carved into time. There were no parades, no documentaries, just a neighborhood. Changed. Not every fight needs fists. Sometimes all it takes is stillness, and ownership, and the kind of love that doesn't announce itself. Just shows up, and stays. If this story made you pause, it means you're part of the reason it matters. We don't just tell stories, we uncover what's buried beneath the surface. Stick around if you believe power can be quiet, and change can be permanent. The next story might not shake the ground, but it'll show you who owns it.